Hey, good evening. Now today I want to take just a moment to reflect and take you through historical events that you need to understand as a student of comparative studies. You see, any person trying to read this book, the Quran, can be frustrated if you approach it as an historical book, probably like the Bible. You will be frustrated because the Quran is not an historical book. The events that are written here are not narrated as a historical fact. In fact, if you attempt to read the Quran, you find that a narrative may be written in this chapter, and then the next thing is something else is brought up, and this story will be picked in a different chapter. And so for a student of history, it is very hard for you to be able to understand the events that are written herein. And therefore, just to help us understand, and I'm talking to you as a Christian, and as probably I know of many Muslims that even do not understand these things. They may memorize the Quran, but they do not understand it as an historical book. And so, let me just try and help us in understanding these events. For instance, you need to know when was the Quran, when did this book come into existence? Very important. The first thing you need to understand that Muhammad is an historical figure. He lived. When did he live? Now, in those days, the Arabs did not, have a calendar like we do today, a modern calendar, and so events were said to have occurred according to a significant thing that happened on those days. One of it was. It is said that during the year that Muhammad was born, there were soldiers that came to Makkah, and they were riding on elephants, and so it was known as the year of the elephant. Historians believe that this must have been around 570 AD or 571 AD, depending with which book you read. But then most historians would agree on 570 AD as the year of his birth. Sunni Muslims also tell us that when Muhammad was about 4 years or 6 years, there was an event that the angel Gabriel came down and was able to expand the chest of Muhammad and wash it with the water of Zamzam, which is the well in Makkah, and he was able to remove the portion of the devil that was in Muhammad. That is an event that we will come to talk about. But this time, Muhammad was, as a child, was being taken care of by a mother called Halima, who was, the foster mother. Another important date for you to remember, if we just run through, is that at the age of 25, Muhammad marries this lady who was 40. Her name is Khadija. We are also told about an event that occurred when around his teenhood, probably around age 10 or 12, where Muhammad is said to have met a Christian monk, and this Christian monk is said to have seen and prophesied about his prophethood. That is an event that most Muslim scholars would agree on, that he met this guy called Mughira, and he was able to identify that this child would be a great man. The other event that you need to know as a student of comparative studies is around the age of 38 to 40, Muhammad begins to have supplications in the caves of Makkah, going outside the city and just having time to meditate. And at the age of 40, he is said to one day being in the cave, a night in the month of Ramadan, in the 9th month, a being descended on him, and he and squeezed Muhammad, and the events of that day. This is what is said. That is the time that is said to have received his call of prophethood, and having a meeting with a Christian, an historian Christian called Waraka bin Naufal, who was a relative of his wife Khadija. And it is this gentleman that actually tells him, whoever that appeared to you on the cave was the Namus, the messenger, who appeared to Isa, and he also appeared to Moses. So pronounce yourself as a prophet. And so Muhammad comes from there, and he proclaims himself as a prophet. It is worth to note that this being at this early age, there are narratives that are contradictory to each other, but there is a narrative that suggests that this being did not identify itself to Muhammad, and therefore Muhammad came out of this cave. He was perplexed. We are told of events of even him wanting to kill himself, to throw himself out of the from a cliff. We will come to talk about those events, but this is around 610, 40 years after his birth. Very important dates to remember. Another event is that in the next 10 years, Muhammad will be preaching a message of peace. He will be preaching a message of reconciliation, trying to reach out to the Christians, to the Jews, to other people, and persuading even the Qurayshi, his own people, to Islam. And at this time, Muhammad will be persecuted. At one point, the Muslims even have to run to the Christian nation of Ethiopia just to run away from this persecution and intimidation. And after 10 years, another important date that you need to note is around 621, when Muhammad is said to have been one night he was miraculously taken from Mecca, his own town, his own city, and it's taken to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem he ascends up to the 7th heaven, and there he is given the 5 prayers. They were 50, and he came down and he had to talk with Moses, and he kept on talking with Moses. And this is something we will come to talk about much later. But that event is said to have happened around 621 AD. In this year also, 2 events that happened, 2 people that left Muhammad suddenly when they died, and that was his wife Khadija and his uncle, paternal uncle Abi Talib. When these 2 gentlemen died, when this Abi Talib and his wife, died, they left him without a shield. They left him open to attacks, because as long as these people were still alive, they were powerful, they had the money, they were influential, and they kept him in a way from persecution. And so when they died, within 3 days, Muhammad is said to have been saddened by these deaths, and all of a sudden Muhammad was open to attack. And it is after these events that in 622 AD, Muhammad could not take it anymore, and the Qurayshis, his own people, wanted to kill him. The likes of Abu Jahl, who is said to be the father of fools. That was not his name, but that is a name that he has been nicknamed among Muslim scholars. And this gentleman led the others in persecuting Muhammad. And in 622, Muhammad eventually did an event, we call it the Hijrah. He had to flee for his life, and he fled his hometown, his home city, and he went to a city called Yathrib. When he went to Yathrib, eventually this city was called Madinah al-Munawwar, the city of the Prophet. And therefore, the next 10 years are going to be very critical. And my friend David Wood does a very good job in trying to, compare between the Meccan and Medinan period of his life. And you will be stricken by the differences. When Muhammad was in Mecca, he was weak in terms of military power, and therefore you would find that the sound and the tone of the verses that came in these 10 years that Muhammad proclaimed, they were verses that were reconciling. They were verses that were, for instance, it says in Surah 2, chapter 2 and verse 62, it says, to the Christians and to the Jews and to the Sabaeans, whoever among them that will believe in the last day and do good deeds, such kind of person will have no fear on the last day. In other words, you can remain a Christian, you can remain a Jew, as long as you believe in the Yawmul Qiyamah, in the last day. You believe in Allah, you do good deeds. You don't need to be a Muslim. You would find such verses like La Ikraha fil Din. There is no compulsion in religion. You can remain a Muslim and I can remain a Christian. And when Muhammad is persecuted at this time, even by his own people, what does he tell them? You have your God, I have my God. I cannot worship what you worship. You cannot worship what I worship. That is Surah Al-Kafirun. You will find that these verses are very distinct. They are very, very nice, you would say. He's calling them and he's saying, if you want to come, come. If you don't want to come, just remain, But then something happens when Muhammad now is in power. All of a sudden, the tone of the Quran changes, and now you find surah like Surah Al-Tawbah. This is chapter 9, the chapter of the sword. And you would suddenly realize that the tone of the Quran even changes. And now you find that for you to remain as a Christian, as a Jew, you got to pay tax, jizya. And this is something that we can come and talk about much later. But then these are events that are happening. And then in 630, Muhammad leading a military team of about 10,000 soldiers comes and takes over his own city of Makkah, in what is called Fatul Makkah. He takes this city back without shedding any blood. He takes this city back with military conquest and proclaims Islam. And shortly afterwards, he has the final pilgrimage. And in 632, another important date, Muhammad all of a sudden dies. He dies unexpectedly. He dies without leaving the Quran collected together as one single volume. There was no single volume of all the verses of the Quran written down as a book during his lifetime, nor at this period. And so when he dies in 622, there is, of course, later on, as we will see in history, that there were fights. And these fights were not concerned about prophethood, really. They were more about power and about who would lead after him. And eventually, there is consensus. And this is something that can be debated among Muslim scholars, among Sunni and Shia scholars, and whether this form of consensus was good. Anyway, that said and done, Abu Bakr comes over. He takes over in 632 to 634. And when Abu Bakr comes into power, he makes the first attempt to bring the verses of the Quran together and have them written down as a book through Sa'id bin Thabit. And it is after him, Umar bin Khattab comes over, and he reigns for around 10 years. And after Umar is killed, and then Uthman bin Affan comes. Uthman bin Affan as the third Khalifa, the third leader after Muhammad. He is the one now that would do a very significant thing. When he realized that the Muslims in Iraq, in Uzbekistan and all over were reading the Quran in different ways, and there was differences arising among the Muslim Ummah as regarding the Quran, then he called Sa'id bin Thabit and some other young men, and and he gives them authority to, write down the Quran as a single, collect it together as a single book. And we will come and talk about Jamul Quran, the collection of the Quran into a single codex. But then this is the time, around 18 years after the Prophet Muhammad has died and left the earth, that this Quran is actually eventually written down as a single book into what we currently know as 6,236 verses of the Quran, 114 chapters of the Quran as we know them today. And this is something we will again come and talk about. But those are very important dates for you to get to know. And after Uthman is killed in 656, the collection of the Quran is around 650 after Christ. In around 656, Uthman bin Affan is killed by fellow Muslims from Egypt, and when he is killed, of course Ali takes over, and there are people that were feeling, in a way that Ali had contributed to to Uthman being killed, and many other reasons that arose around that time, and he had to fight with Muawiyah and Aisha. You remember Aisha, the child bride of Muhammad, the daughter of Abu Bakr, and he had to fight with them, and what has been known as the Battle of the Camel. And we will come and talk about all those things much later. But then when eventually Ali bin Abi Talib is killed, and when he is killed during the month of Ramadan, eventually dies on the 21st of Ramadan, around 5 years or so after him ruling. And so he didn't rule so much. So those are very important dates for you to remember. And of course, Hassan and Hussein, his sons, bury him. And so these are very important things for you to remember as a student of comparative religion. That so what am I saying in conclusion? That when you get to know these events, then as you approach this book, you will get to understand that it is a book that was written at a certain period of time. So remember, 570, this child is born to Amina and Abdullah. And when he's born, we will talk about that in a wider perspective. But then in 610, he declares himself a prophet. In 621, he declares that he has been, to the seventh heaven and back, and been given 5 obligatory prayers. And in 622, the event of the Hijrah, he escapes his own land, going into Yathrib or Medina. And in Medina, the next 10 years, he proclaims Islam. In 630, he comes and takes over his own city of Makkah, and in 632, he dies. The Quran is said to have descended to him, using the Islamic terminology, descended to him in a period of 22 or 23 years until his sudden death in 632. So those are very good historical data that you might want to remember as you approach this book. And then perhaps